There was a shadow that crept through every level of Tudor society, from the grimiest brothel to the most opulent royal bedchamber. They called it the Great Pox. We know it today as syphilis. It was a dreadful disease, a slow and agonizing decay that could rot the flesh, collapse the nose, and drive a person mad before it finally claimed their life. In an age without antibiotics, a diagnosis was a death sentence. But the Tudor physician, ever resourceful, believed they had found an answer, a miracle substance. It was silvery, liquid, and captivating to behold. It was Mercury. The theory, rooted in the alchemical belief that mercury could purify, was that this toxic metal could somehow drive the disease out of the body. The most common application was a mercury ointment, a greasy unguent that was slathered over the sores and lesions that riddled a patient's body. They would be coated in this shimmering poison, sometimes for weeks on end. A more extreme treatment involved fumigation. The unfortunate patient would be seated, naked, inside a small tent or beneath a canopy. A fire would be lit beneath a bowl of mercury, and the patient would be forced to inhale the toxic fumes, their body sweating profusely in the intense heat. They called this salivation, and it was seen as a sign of success. The patient would drool uncontrollably, their gums would ache, their teeth would loosen and fall out, and the physicians would nod sagely, believing the evil humors of the disease were being expelled. Of course, we know now they were simply witnessing the horrific symptoms of acute mercury poisoning. The treatment was a race, a desperate gamble to see if the mercury would kill the patient before the syphilis did. It ravaged the nervous system, destroyed the kidneys, and induced a terrifying madness of its own. Men like King Henry VIII's own advisor, Cardinal Wolsey, are believed to have undergone this torturous process. Imagine the desperation to willingly submit to having your body painted with poison, or to sit in a suffocating tent breathing in metallic fumes, all for the faintest hope of a cure. For most, it was a hope that led only to a faster, more agonizing end. A true viper's kiss, promising life while delivering only death. The human mind, even today, is a landscape of profound mystery. For the Tudors, it was a place of divine inspiration and demonic possession. When a mind broke, when a person was seized by fits, crippling headaches, or what we would now call severe mental illness, the diagnosis was often terrifyingly simple. Something was trapped inside the skull, and it needed to get out. It could be a demon, a pocket of bad air, or a malevolent humor. The solution was equally brutally simple. They had to open a door. This procedure, ancient and horrifying, is known as trepanning. It involved drilling, cutting, or scraping a hole through the skull of a living patient. The tools were rudimentary, more suited to a carpenter's bench than a surgeon's table. A physician, or often a barber surgeon, would use a hand-cranked drill called a trepan, or a circular saw-like instrument, to bore through the bone. There was no anesthetic to speak of, save for a leather strap to bite down on, and perhaps a gutful of strong wine. The patient would be held down, fully conscious, as the surgeon worked, the grating sound of metal on bone a prelude to the unimaginable pain. The goal was to create an opening through which the malevolent spirit or pressure could escape. If the patient survived the initial shock and the agony of the procedure, The barber surgeon would then cover the raw, exposed brain with a metal plate or a piece of linen and hope for the best. The risk of infection was, of course, astronomical. To have a hole bored into your head in an era that had no concept of sterilization was to invite a swift and septic death. Yet, archaeologists have found skulls from this period and earlier with evidence of healing around the trepanned hole, suggesting that, impossibly, some people did survive. But what kind of life did they return to? Did the release of pressure offer some temporary relief from a subdural hematoma mistaken for madness? Or did it simply replace one form of suffering with another? It's a chilling thought, to seek a cure for the terrors in your mind, only to have them physically carved into your very skull. Perhaps no medical theory dominated the ancient and medieval world more completely than that of the four Humours. The belief was that the human body was composed of four essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. A healthy person had these humours in perfect balance. Illness, therefore, was simply a matter of one humour becoming too dominant. A fever meant too much blood. Melancholy meant too much black bile. The cure, then, was logical. You simply had to remove the excess. This led to the most common of all Tudor medical practices, bloodletting. It was the answer to almost everything, from a common cold to the bubonic plague. There were two primary methods. The first, and most common, was venesection, or the cutting of a vein. A physician would consult a complex astrological chart, a zodiac man, to determine the precise location on the body to make an incision, based on the alignment of the stars and the nature of the ailment. A small knife, a lancet, would be used to open a vein, usually in the arm, and the blood would be drained into a bowl. The amount was often staggering, enough to cause the patient to faint, a state known as syncope, which was often misinterpreted as a sign that the body had been successfully purged of its ills. The second method was more biological. It involved the use of leeches. These blood-sucking invertebrates would be placed on the patient's skin, where they would attach themselves and drink their fill. They were seen as a gentler, more natural way to rebalance the humours. Leeches were so central to medicine that physicians themselves were often called leeches. But whether by blade or by worm, the result was the same. A person already weakened by illness was further depleted. Their body, desperate for resources to fight off infection, was being systematically drained of the very fluid that carried oxygen and life. It was a universal prescription that turned minor illnesses into major crises, and major illnesses into certain death. A perfect, logical system that was perfectly, fatally wrong. The Black Death was a recurring nightmare for the Tudors. When the plague arrived in a town, it was like a sentence of death for the entire community. The fear was absolute, a palpable entity that stalked the streets alongside the disease itself. In the face of such an overwhelming and inexplicable foe, medicine and magic became indistinguishable. And from this desperate union of superstition and science came one of the most bizarre preventative measures imaginable: the toad amulet. The logic, though twisted, had its own internal consistency. It was based on the idea that like cures like. Toads were seen as creatures of poison and filth, creatures that thrived in the dark, damp places where pestilence was thought to breed. It was believed that a toad, being inherently evil and venomous, could act as a natural magnet for the evil of the plague. It would draw the poison out of the air or out of a person's body into itself. The creation of one such amulet was a ghoulish ritual. A live toad would be hung by its legs in a chimney for several days until it was thoroughly dried and hardened. The desiccated corpse would then be ground into a powder, or, more commonly, placed whole into a small silk or linen bag. This grim sachet was then worn around the neck, pressed against the skin, as a personal defense against the plague. Some physicians went even further, recommending that a live toad be pressed against a plague sore or bubo until the creature swelled up and burst, having supposedly absorbed the poison. We can only imagine the horror of that scene. A person, feverish and dying, having a struggling amphibian held against their open wounds. Of course, the amulet offered no protection whatsoever. It was a talisman of fear, a desperate, grotesque symbol of humanity's helplessness in the face of a microscopic enemy it could not see, let alone comprehend.
In our modern sterile world, the idea of using animal excrement as a medical treatment is repulsive. But in Tudor England, the line between the farmyard and the pharmacy was considerably more blurred. When it came to treating wounds, infections, and even tumors, physicians often turned to ingredients that were plentiful, if not particularly pleasant. Chief among them was animal dung. A poultice is a soft, moist mass, often heated, that is applied to the body to relieve soreness and inflammation. Today, we might use a warm compress. The Tudors used a paste made of dung. The dung of a pig was considered particularly effective for treating boils and abscesses. Pigeon droppings were mixed with other ingredients to create a remedy for baldness. The logic was, in its own way, tied to the humoral theory. It was believed that the warmth and properties of the dung could draw out the bad humors that were causing the affliction. For a wound, a common treatment was a poultice made from fresh, warm cow dung, applied directly to the open cut. The idea was that this would seal the wound and promote healing. What it actually did, of course, was introduce a universe of deadly bacteria, tetanus, gangrene, and countless others directly into the bloodstream. It was, quite literally, applying filth to an injury. Another popular remedy, especially for skin diseases, was a balsam made from puppy fat and earthworms. And for a sore throat, a common prescription was to take a collar of fresh human urine and dog feces and wear it around the neck. It is difficult for us to even conceive of the stench, the sheer filth of these treatments. They represent a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of infection, a world where the concept of germs was still centuries away, and where the most readily available materials, no matter how foul, were seen as a gift from God to be used in the fight against disease.
Not all Tudor cures were concocted by physicians. One of the most sought-after treatments could not be bought in an apothecary or administered by a surgeon. It could only be given by God's anointed representative on earth, the monarch. The disease was scrofula, a form of tuberculosis that affects the lymph nodes in the neck, causing grotesque, weeping swellings and abscesses. It was known throughout Europe as the king's evil, and it was believed that only the legitimate touch of a king or queen could cure it. This belief was a powerful piece of political propaganda.
It reinforced the idea of the divine right of kings, suggesting that the monarch possessed a supernatural, God-given power. The touching ceremony was a major royal event. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of afflicted subjects would gather at court, waiting for their chance to be healed. The monarch, in a solemn and highly ritualized ceremony, would walk among them, laying their hands upon the swollen necks and faces of the sufferers, often while a priest recited prayers. Queen Elizabeth I, for example, is said to have touched over 90,000 people during her long reign. After the touching, each person was given a special gold coin known as a touch piece or an angel, which they were to wear around their neck to prevent a relapse. The demand for this cure was immense. For the poor and the desperate, suffering from a disfiguring and painful disease, the chance to be in the presence of the monarch and receive a divine cure was the hope of a lifetime. Did it work? Of course not in a medical sense, but the power of belief, the placebo effect, is a potent force. Perhaps for some, the psychological boost of having been touched by the Queen, combined with the natural waxing and waning of the disease, gave the impression of a cure. But for most, it was a moment of fleeting hope in a life of suffering. A royal ritual that treated the body politic far more effectively than it treated the bodies of the sick. In the highest echelons of Tudor society, where wealth was boundless and the fear of death was all-consuming, there was a belief that the ultimate cure, the ultimate preventative, could be found not in herbs or animals, but in the very substance of wealth itself: gold and precious gems. This was the realm of alchemy and high medicine, a search for an elixir of life that could grant not just health, but perhaps even a form of immortality. The theory was that gold, being the most perfect and incorruptible of metals, must contain a powerful life-giving essence. If this essence could be extracted and consumed, it would purify the body and ward off all disease. This led to the creation of potable gold, aurum potabile. Alchemists and physicians would spend fortunes on complex and often fruitless attempts to dissolve gold into a drinkable liquid. When that proved impossible, they resorted to simply adding flecks of gold leaf or gold filings to wine or other cordials. Wealthy nobles would drink these golden potions, believing they were ingesting a powerful medicine, when in reality, they were just consuming an inert and very expensive metal. Precious gems were given similar treatment. Emeralds were thought to cure epilepsy and dysentery. Sapphires were believed to be an antidote to poison. Pearls were prized for their ability to soothe the heart and calm the mind. These gems would be crushed into a fine powder using a mortar and pestle, and then mixed into drinks or food. Queen Elizabeth I herself was known to take a restorative broth containing crushed pearls and gold. Imagine the sheer waste. A fortune in precious stones, painstakingly ground to dust to be eaten in a spoonful of soup. It is the ultimate expression of the Tudor medical worldview, a world of sympathetic magic, where the symbolic properties of a substance were considered more important than its actual physical effects. It was a desperate, glittering, and utterly useless attempt to cheat death by consuming the very symbols of earthly power. A final poignant reminder that in the face of our own mortality, even the wealthiest and most powerful among us can be led to the most bizarre and irrational of hopes.